Back live with you tonight, John in Focus, and thanks for staying on. Housing woes continue to haunt Alexandra Township residents in Johannesburg after some families were forced to spend the night on the streets. The City of Johannesburg reportedly evicted them from container housing, which was set up to mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic. The former Johannesburg Housing MMC Mlungisi Mabaso joins us now for more background on that story. Good to have you. Thank you very much for your time. It was May 2020 when you yourself made the announcement that you will be relocating 1,600 of 5,100 households in a congested Alexandra to put them in two sites that would have been identified. What was the thinking around setting up those sites?
Well, thank you very much, Putu Mdluli, and greetings to yourself and the viewers at home. Well, the intention there was to decongest the informal settlements within Alexandra and Marlborough area. Remember, at the time, there was a reported COVID case in Alexandra, which prompted a rapid response from the Department of Human Settlement. So when the Minister of Human Settlement at the time, Honorable Sisulu, introduced this grant of temporary emergency accommodation to decongest the informal settlements, which were highly, densely populated, the City of Johannesburg took that advantage, to utilize those grants to the advantage of assisting our residents who are staying in the highly dense populated informal settlements. And that's why that program was introduced in the City of Johannesburg, because we were trying to address, the issues of human settlements within the informal settlements, the congestion within the informal settlements, which was posing a danger to the lives of the residents because of the COVID pandemic that was reported at the time.
So you said this was going to take 3 to 4 months. It was supposed to be a program that would take 3 to 4 months. It is now 2024. Why did it not happen in 3 to 4 months?
Well, it couldn't happen in the months that we had anticipated, purely because when the program was introduced, there were quite a number of technical questions that were posed to implementing agents. And one of the questions was that will the service, basic services be provided in a form of running taps within the unit, electricity and so forth. And we had then, learned that at the time when the program was introduced, all those basic services were not included in the scope of work. The only idea was that there will be water tanks that will be provided and there will be no electricity that will be installed because it was for emergency response. But what we then said was that because these containers were to be staggered, so it was not going to be appropriate to expect a person that will come from the third floor to go down to fetch water from the tank, and climb the stairs, with a 20-liter in a hand or in a head, going up to the units in the third floor. We then said, no, we need to make sure that as much as we are responding to a pandemic, as much as we are trying to de-densify the informal settlement, but we also need to bring dignity to the life of our residents, which then made them to go back and redo all the designs and the plans so that they are able to incorporate the provision of services in those particular temporary residential units that were to be constructed. But the second factor was the investigation, which took almost a year, where there was a complaint from one of the contractors who had, reported to have been a competent contractor to perform that particular responsibility, and there was a complaint which was then submitted to the SIU, and we had to allow the investigation to run to completion so that we do not stand in the way of the law enforcement agents when they were dealing with the complaint which they had received at the time. So that also, caused, delays in the completion of the project. But as it currently stands, I can't tell you why those units have not been allocated, because my understanding is that they were completed and they were waiting for the allocation. Because at the time when the units were in the implementation stage, the project, I mean to say, was in the implementation stage, we had also commenced with the identification of beneficiaries, and we had ran that process. The department, the unit in the department that was responsible for the allocation was busy on the ground identifying beneficiaries, so that when the units are completed, we do not wait for the verification of beneficiaries. We allocate them as and when the units get to be completed. I drove past by that Marlborough site today when I left my meeting in Midrand, and I saw that there are no activities taking place within those sites. It's quiet, and we do not know the reasons why those units are still vacant, because my understanding was that should the site be completed, then it must then be handed over to the department for an immediate allocation.
So we'll come back to that. Let's stay with the part that where you are still responsible. In 2021, rumors mounted that the residents are saying those containers are lying there vacant. They're going to go and occupy them. And the warning was issued from government to say, don't do that, because law enforcement agencies are going to deal with you. What else did you do when it became clear that those are going to be occupied?
Well, the provision of security has always been there to protect the properties from vandalism and hijacking and invasion. And I think it's one of the things that we've been trying to deal with, the scourge of invasions in the city of Johannesburg. Since 2016, when I joined the council in 2016, so it's one of the areas where the law enforcement agency and the leadership of the city have been backing to try and mitigate and find strategies to deal with the invasions, because in a way they tend to disrupt the planning of proper developments in the city. So when we learn about that, we strengthen our security. But even before we learned of the intentions to invade, we had already provided security to protect those containers there, because we understood that they are standing vulnerable because they are within our communities, and there are people who will actually take advantage of the situation and try to rob the residents who are eligible to benefit in that particular project. Yeah.
So by the time, I think it was 2022, you'll correct me, when then your administration would have been voted out in that council, and the ANC coalition would have come in. Two things that I want to know. Were environmental assessment studies completed? Was a plan in place or even work done in as far as making sure that bulk services are available?
Well, that's what we had requested them to do. Remember, when the project was initiated in the first place, those are the technical questions that we're putting forth to say we need to comply and we shall not engage ourselves in processes where we have not properly followed our own plans or processes that we have put in place as the City of Johannesburg when we talk to the developments within our jurisdiction. So all those questions were asked, and there was work that was done together with development planning for our plans to be approved, and other entities which are supplying or are providing other services like your water and your electricity. They were also engaged, and they also adopted those plans. Hence, we were able to work towards putting in electricity, putting in water and the gas, the supply of gas at Madala hostel, because there is also development that is taking place there. So all the responsible entities were engaged. They knew what was happening, and they were part of the process. Hence, they were able to even do their own assessment in terms of the bulk capacity within the area, and the department was advised in areas where there was a need for us to increase capacity within the area so that we are able to provide services in those particular TRUs.
Yeah. How much money would have been spent at that particular point?
Well, I can't remember exactly the budget, because when I left, the project was not yet completed, so it would be very difficult for me to talk to the amount of money that was spent. But the budget that was allocated for that particular project, because it was a conditional grant, so when it was allocated to us from the national government, it had a condition that we do temporary residential accommodation in response to COVID, and that money was 341 million, which was allocated to the city for the implementation of that particular project.
Yeah. So at the time that you then left, was the project built? Was the project completed? I know you've already said people were allocated, but what was the state of the project?
Well, the project was not fully completed. I mean, the containers were there. They were properly installed. I think there were few remedial work that were to be completed for the units to be fully completed. But the other factor I think that I need to put in this discussion is that, I had taken a decision that there will be no allocation that will happen in the absence of a completion certificate, whether it's a permanent completion certificate or a temporal completion certificate, because in order for you to obtain the completion certificate, it must have, all boxed, ticked in your checklist. So I said to them, before we could do allocation, I need to see temporarily a completion certificate or permanent completion certificate, which will then would have said to me, we have ticked all the box and the units are ready for allocation. So at the time when I left the office, the occupational certificates and the completion certificates were not yet ready, because I think they would have not ticked all the boxes.
Are you surprised that those occupational certificates are still not ready? Because as we speak now, they're saying those occupational certificates are still not there, and citing environmental assessment studies that have not been completed, and 100 million rands later that has been spent. It's bizarre to say you spend 100 million rands and then later say, oh, we still have not got an environmental assessment done.
Well, that would be unfortunate. If the completion certificate has not yet been completed, because the environmental studies are done in the city. The project was implemented in the city. So it's departments that should be talking to each other. So they cannot work in silos, if they want projects to benefit our communities. So they really need to talk to each other so that they are able to complete, whatever work that they need to complete for the occupational certificate to be issued, so that beneficiaries are able to access their units there.
COVID-19 shelters built and set up back in 2020, but up until today, still not a soul inside those containers. Some families were forced to the streets this past week because they had reportedly occupied those containers. We have the former housing MMC Mlungisi Mabaso with us to give us some context to what is happening there. So the residents are saying it's either one, we are being kicked out now because there's political interference, and they are pre-selected individuals who are being set up to actually be beneficiaries of that. How likely is that?
Well, I wouldn't, be privy to the current events that occur in that particular area regarding the unoccupation or the illegal occupation that took place. But I think in the normal circumstance, the city will respond if there are invasion, because I think there is no justification really to illegal occupation. Even if there are delays in terms of development, I think patience is paramount, because immediately when you go and invade, you are also depriving the other beneficiaries the right to occupation or to benefit to a particular project. So we had always discouraged our residents from taking the law into their own hands. But I think I had indicated earlier on to say we had started a process of identifying beneficiaries because we understood that it is in fact imperative for us to give ourselves time to engage in the process of identifying beneficiaries so that we allocate the correct people in those units, people who are really deserving to be there, not to do a rush job where you will end up taking wrong people and be accused of allocating people who were not supposed to benefit. And I think the residents of Alexandra had a very bad experience when it comes to allocation and beneficiation in government developments. And I think the case in point is your Alexandra renewal project, where we have seen the establishment of Tutula, where some of the residents were pushed out of the houses because it was alleged that they were wrongfully allocated. So we'll understand the frustration and the panic that the residents might have because of the previous experiences. But I think when we started the process on time, we wanted to mitigate against all those panics and frustrations so that we are able to allocate the rightful beneficiaries. We even said to the councillors when we met with them discussing the allocation to say, we are going to call public meetings to read out the names of the identified beneficiaries so that the residents themselves can tell us if those people are actually coming from the areas where the beneficiaries will need to be sourced.
Yeah. So, as we sit right now, I've only read one criteria for what would have been the beneficiaries, at least would have been that they needed to be South African citizens. So of the 5,100 households that you had identified, the 1,600 would need to have been South African citizens. What other criteria was there?
Well, the criteria for us that was going to be used was that you must be a South African citizen, you must be, within the housing need register, so you must be a person that have applied for an RDP giveaway house, in a simple term. But also we're going to identify those beneficiaries within the informal settlements that are highly congested, because that program was going to be implemented concurrently with the UISP, the upgrade of informal settlement program, where we were going to, to reblock the shacks, realign them, then provide, services within those informal settlements and formalize them, because it got various stages of implementation. So we were not going to just take people out of the informal settlement and leave it at that. So we were going to use those spaces within the informal settlements to develop and formalize those particular informal settlements. And that's why it was imperative for us to focus on the informal settlements, which are highly densely populated and congested, so that we are able to decongest them, reblock them, realign them, give people services. So that's how we're going to implement this program coming to the allocation of beneficiaries in those containers.
Is this a project likely to go up in smoke as one of those fruitless and wasteful expenditures that the city would have incurred?
Well, it shouldn't. There was money invested there, and there are services that have been put in there, and our people, have not had, access to services such as the ones that have been installed there. So it can't be a wasteful expenditure, and the leadership of the city need to take it up upon themselves to make sure that they see that development to completion. Yes, we left the project, at practical completion, but they need to oversee, and push for the completion so that they are able to allocate those units. So what if I do not come back as the MMC? Then what? Because they cannot say because the project was implemented during your time, Councillor Mabaso, come back and allocate people. If they could give me those powers, I would go back and do that, because I understand that it was meant to benefit our residents who are in dire need, of access to basic services, who need shelter, who are tired of sitting in congested areas. So the leadership of the city really need to take it up, upon themselves to make sure that they attend to that project so that they are able to allocate the rightful beneficiaries. So it can't really be a wasteful expenditure, and that will be an enlightenment, to the residents of Johannesburg who are in dire need, of access to that particular project, because it's meant to benefit people who are in dire need of accommodation in the city.
Right, Mlungisi Mabaso, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on, former MMC for Human Settlement in the city of Johannesburg. Right.